Okay, so I want to go over this review paper, which is called A Review of Melatonin, Its Receptors, and Drugs. So, this is going to get a little bit technical, so I'll do a quick little synopsis of what melatonin is, and then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of everything. So, melatonin. This is usually referred to as a sleep hormone. So, it's produced oftentimes in the pineal gland, and then it basically will work, or how do I phrase that? It helps regulate your circadian rhythm so that you are sleepy when it's dark out, and then by the time you wake up, you should have low levels of melatonin and be able to wake up refreshed, right? Now that is an overly simplified definition as to what melatonin does in the body. So melatonin, I'll get this Wikipedia article up for you to go through the chemical structure of it. So this is melatonin. And so this is closely related to serotonin. So let me get the serotonin molecule up. Serotonin. So this is serotonin. And serotonin has this indole ring. It has this hydroxy group that is coming off of it. And then it has this ethyl group, or two carbons with hydrogens in between. And then you have this amine group. And so this is usually considered a monoamine, one amine neurotransmitter. Okay, so it has a popular image as a contributor to feelings of well-being and happiness, and that is, that is true. Serotonin will bind to serotonin receptors and often will make you feel happy. Now, that is serotonin. So melatonin is similar to serotonin in that it has the general similar structure, except this oxygen that was over here on serotonin, this is methylated, so it has an extra methyl group, and this nitrogen over here, rather than it being just a nitrogen, it's now an amide group, where it has this acetyl group that is covalently bonded to it. And this is, rather than just being an amine, it is now an amide, or an amide. And so, this melatonin is released by the pineal gland. So this pineal gland will be producing it and excreting it into the environment or into your body. It is a dietary supplement as well, but this is exclusive. I think it's exclusively a United States thing. I shouldn't say exclusively United States, but in the rest of the world, it can theoretically be more regulated and have to be given as a part of a prescription rather than it being on the shelves. However, in the United States, melatonin is found directly on the shelves. You can get it whenever you want. And it is often used for the treatment or the short-term treatment of insomnia, such as from jet lag or shift work. So the evidence of benefits is unclear. So that is what melatonin looks like, at least. Okay, and I don't know if there's anything else that I should. Yes, I can just get this up. Just know that the pineal gland produces this melatonin, and at night this will be secreted, and the peripheral oscillators, just know that these are sort of like biological clocks that are going on throughout your entire body. They isolate back and forth, and melatonin is one of the things that can help regulate or synchronize those peripheral oscillators. Anyways, when there is light coming out, it hits your eyes, and then the eyes are able to somehow prevent the production of melatonin. But once the sun goes down, you have a buildup of it that ends up getting out into the environment. So just keep that in mind. So I think I'll leave it at that because the review will be pretty comprehensive as far as what all is going on. So that is melatonin, but melatonin does not work in of itself. It also works with its receptors, and then this review also touches upon some drugs. So let's just jump into it. So after a Turkish scientist took the Nobel Prize due to his contributions to understand clock genes, so these oscillators that we were talking about earlier, melatonin, closely related to these genes, may begin to shine. So I should also mention that these authors are from Turkey. I believe all of them are from Turkey, it looks like, or at least all of them have work in Turkey. They look like Turkish names, so, that's why I think they have a little bit of pride in saying that a Turkish scientist took pride in taking the Nobel Prize. regardless, melatonin, a hormone secreted from the pineal gland at night, plays a role in regulating the sleep-wake cycle. But not just that, it also regulates pubertal development and seasonal adaptation. So how could this work with seasonal adaptation? So the way that a lot of organisms can actually keep track of what time of the year it is through the day-night cycle. So you do know that in the summer, the days are long and the nights are short, and at the wintertime, the nights are long and the days are short. Well, that could theoretically be, or I do know that that is a mechanism by which some plants will actually regulate whether or not they decide to fruit or to flower or to go into hibernation for the winter, is by checking upon or looking at how long the days are. So presumably with this, melatonin might also be playing a role in helping us adapt to the seasons by telling us how long or how short the days are. Regardless, let's continue. So melatonin has anti-nociceptive. What does that mean, anti-nociceptive? So the blocking the detection of painful or injurious stimuli. So it's anti-pain. Nociceptive is painful, so anti-nociceptive would be something that inhibits pain. So it can block pain. It can be block pain. It can be antidepressant. It can be or anxiolytic. And what is anxiolytic? That means getting rid of anxiousness. So anxiolytic drugs are drugs that are used to reduce anxiety. It can also be anti-neophobic, which would be I actually don't know what this means. So anti-neophobic definition. So here they're talking about xenophobia. So neo means new, so neophobia would be the fear of things that are new, but I don't think that that's what... Let's look up anti-neophobic medical definition. I apologize for this. Yeah, dread or aversion to novelty. I don't know if this is the proper word that they want to be using here. However, let's continue. So, it's also locomotor activity regulating. It is neuroprotective. It is anti-inflammatory. It is pain modulating, which is what anti-nociceptive also means. It can reduce blood pressure. It can help with the retina. It can help with the vascular system. It can help, there are some anti-tumor effects, and there are antioxidant effects. So, laying it on thick right here, right? It is related with memory, the ovarian physiology, and osteoblast differentiation. And the osteoblast, these are the cells that can turn into bone, so the cells that secrete the matrix for bone formation. So they are the ones that help make the bones, which is in contrast to the osteoclasts, which are the cells that break down bone. So don't mix up osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. So pathologies associated with an increase or decrease in melatonin levels are summarized in this review. Melatonin elicits their effects through 4 mechanisms, and I should also mention this is a review article that was written by people who English is not their native language. So every once in a while there might be some syntactical errors, but we can definitely work around those without any issue. So there is binding to melatonin receptors in the plasma membrane, which is the first one. So let us look up and that is number 1. What is a melatonin receptor? So, and I'm going to actually have to dig a little deep for us to understand this fully. So, melatonin receptors are G-protein coupled receptors, which bind to melatonin. Okay. What is a G-protein coupled receptor? So G-protein coupled receptors have many names, because in biology we like having 10 names for the same freaking protein. So it is sometimes called the 7-pass transmembrane domain receptors, and it's called that because they will have 7 passes or 7 helices that will go through the cellular membrane. So you will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 helices that go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 helices will go through the cell membrane, okay? So that's why it's sometimes called a past transmembrane domain, or 7TM receptor, or the heptahelical receptors, or the serpentine receptors because they serpent back and forth, or what is best a best description of its actual function is the G protein linked receptors, or GPLRs. So they are a large group. There are hundreds of these G protein coupled receptors. It is a large group of evolutionarily related proteins that are cell surface receptors that detect molecules outside the cell and activate cellular responses. So coupling with G proteins, which we'll go over that later, they couple with G proteins. They are called 7 transmembrane receptors because they pass through the cell membrane 7 times. So they are these G protein coupled receptors. You have hundreds of different types of these, and they sense something in the environment. They sense their ligand on the outside of the cell in their environment, and then when they bind to their ligand, they shift or they move a little bit. And that movement ends up affecting these G proteins that are on the cytosolic side of the membrane or inside of the cell. Okay? So, and there are 2 principal signal transduction pathways. Sorry, going back. So the G protein coupled receptors are found only in eukaryotes, but that includes yeast and the choanoflagellates, so don't worry too much, and animals. The ligands that bind and activate these receptors can include the light-sensitive compounds, odors, pheromones, hormones, and neurotransmitters. So this is where melatonin comes in, right? So melatonin could be one of these hormones and neurotransmitters that will interact with its melatonin receptor, which is one of these GPCRs. So there are 2 principal signal transduction pathways involving the G protein coupled receptors. One of them is the cyclic adenosine monophosphate signal pathway, and one is the phosphatidylinositol signal pathway. Do not worry too much about those. What we should do, though, is go on to what a G protein is. So remember, this is the G protein coupled receptor, or the GPCR. So these are coupling with these G proteins right here. So this would be an example of a G protein. So G proteins, which are also known as guanine nucleotide binding proteins. So they are called G proteins because they can bind either guanosine diphosphate, which is what you see here. So this is a nucleotide diphosphate, or they can bind to nucleotide guanosine triphosphate, which would be a nucleoside triphosphate. So you have 3 phosphate groups all covalently bound here together. So keep in mind, you can have either this protein binding to either this or this. So they are a family of proteins that act as molecular switches inside of the cell. So how do they switch? They switch by going between either the guanosine diphosphate or the guanosine triphosphate. Okay, so keep that in mind. So they are involved in transmitting signals from a variety of stimuli outside a cell into the interior of the cell. Their activity is regulated by factors that control their ability to bind to and hydrolyze guanosine triphosphate or guanosine diphosphate. When they are bound to GTP, they are on. They are switched to the on state. And when they are bound to GDP, they are switched to the off state. And G proteins belong to the larger group of enzymes called GTPases, or things that can break up a GTP molecule. So let's see if, let's go down to this function, and I think we'll go down to the signaling so that we have a little bit of an idea what's going on. So the function, the G proteins are important in signal transducing molecules in cells. So malfunction of the GPCR, which remember is the receptor, signaling pathways are involved in many diseases such as diabetes, blindness, allergies, depression, cardiovascular defects, and certain forms of cancer. So screw this up out of one of the 800 different G protein coupled receptors, screw up one of these, you can end up with a serious pathology as a result. So it is estimated that about 30% of modern drugs' cellular targets are GPCR. So 1 out of 3 pretty much. Most of the drugs that you take or I shouldn't say most, but a good proportion of the drugs that we take today are often targeting one of these 800 or so G protein coupled receptors. And I apologize, I'm using the wrong number. Apparently there's 150 of these G protein-coupled receptors found in the human genome. Oh, sorry, there are 800 of them, but 150 of them we do not have, we still don't know what their function is. Interesting. So the human genome encodes for roughly 800 of these G protein-coupled receptors, and they can detect things such as photons of light, hormones, growth factors, drugs, and other endogenous ligands. Endogenous being something that comes from within the body, and a ligand is something that binds to a receptor. So, and there's 150 G protein coupled receptors found in the human genome that we don't even know what their function is, right? So that's just crazy to me that there are so many proteins in the body that still we do not know what their function is. Continuing, so whereas G proteins are activated by G protein coupled receptors, they can be inactivated by these RGS proteins, also known as the regulator of G protein signaling. And so these receptors stimulate GTP binding, and these RGSs promote or stimulate the GTP hydrolysis, creating GDP. So when these proteins have GTP inside of them, being this molecule, the receptors that, or shoot, what is the exact name of it? The regulators of G protein signaling. These regulators of G protein signaling will come in and then break this bond right here, which will turn this GTP into a GDP, and that will turn off this protein. However, that isn't necessary. These will randomly break up into the GDP, but that is a much slower way to turn off, okay? So let us continue. Let us just give an example of the common mechanism by which these things work. And this way we will understand how something like melatonin works with the cells in your body. So usually they are heterotrimeric in that these G proteins will be in these trimers with 3 different subunits, right? So let us begin. So the common mechanism, there's a receptor-activated G protein. These receptor-activated G proteins are bound to the inner surface of the cell membrane. They consist of the G sub alpha and the tightly associated G sub beta and gamma subunits. And there are many classes of G sub alpha subunits. You have G sub S alpha, which is G stimulatory. We have the G sub I alpha, which is the G inhibitory, the G naught alpha, the G other. Okay, don't worry about too much. But they behave differently in the recognition of the effector molecule, but they share a similar mechanism of activation. Okay, so just know that there are many different types of these G proteins. Okay, so activation, when the ligand, now in our case, we are going to consider the ligand to be the melatonin molecule. So when the ligand activates the G protein coupled receptor, it induces conformational changes in the receptor. So conformational change, this is biochemical jargon for this molecule will change shape, and by changing shape, it changes its function in some way. So when this ligand binds to the G protein coupled receptor, it changes shape and allows the receptor to function as a guanine nucleotide exchange factor. So it's basically now functioning as a way to exchange GDP with GTP. So thus this turning the GPCR on, the GTP or GDP is bound to the G sub A subunit in the traditional view of the heterotrimeric GPCR activation. This exchange triggers the dissociation of the G sub A subunit, which is bound to GTP from the G sub beta gamma dimer, and the receptor as a whole. However, models which suggest molecular rearrangement, reorganization, and pre-complex effector molecules are beginning to be accepted. So this is obviously, what was this? All models are wrong, but some are useful. So here we have a model of how this is working. However, there will always be another variable that needs to be taken into account, but this is the simplified diagram of what's happening. So here we have our cell membrane with our G protein coupled receptors, and we have 800 of these in our body. Underneath it, generally, I should say in the simplified model, we have this alpha subunit, we have the beta subunit, and the gamma subunit, and all of this constitutes the G protein, or the G coupled protein. And as you can see here, it has this GDP associated with the alpha subunit. Okay? Now, once this little red thing, which is our ligand, or we could call this our melatonin, this comes in and digs itself into this G protein coupled receptor. And after it's bound to this receptor, this shimmies, it changes its shape a little bit, and that is what allows this G protein coupled receptor to then exchange this GDP with a GTP. So here you can see this is the conformational change that happens, and here the GDP has been replaced with GTP. Now, once this happens, this alpha subunit now is able to come off of this, or come out of this complex. And now this is the way for the signal that was once outside of the cell to transduce a signal to the inside of the cell. And now this alpha subunit is now transferring that down. Now granted, eventually, over time, this GTP, this is a high energy molecule, and it's probably going to randomly hydrolyze by itself, or this alpha subunit also has some GTPase activity, if I remember correctly, and so eventually this GTP is going to just deactivate. It's going to go from the on state to the off state. But, and as you can see, that is what's happening here. So that's one way. Another way is those regulators of G proteins, those can also come in and catalytically break apart that GTP back into GDP, and then this whole cycle can start over again. Okay? So just keep in mind, this is what the G proteins, or how these G proteins function. Okay? So, and melatonin receptor is one of those G protein coupled receptors. And so 3 types of melatonin receptors happen, clone, and these are the MT sub 1, or melanin 1A, and MT sub 2, or melanin 1B. And apparently there are multiple types of melatonin receptors, and these receptors are crucial in the signal cascade of melatonin and in the field of chronobiology, which would be the study of keeping track of time in biological systems. So these molecular clocks, or these biological clocks, or these biological oscillators, that would be within the realm of chronobiology. Anyways, melatonin has been found to be a key player in the synchrony of biological clocks. So keep in mind, you have a lot of biological clocks in your body. All the cells in your body try to find some way to have some idea of what time of day it is. And not just time of day, but maybe time of season. And so melatonin will be one of the chemicals that can be secreted by the pineal gland, or sometimes, I believe the skin as well also produces melatonin. Regardless, these melatonin will be one of the ways that you can synchronize all of the clocks in your body over and over again. Because if you could imagine, these clocks, if they are functioning in of themselves and they're not getting any stimulus from the environment, over time these clocks can they can creep away from each other, or their oscillation is not going to align up perfectly. So your body has to develop hormones or some way to signal to the entire body at once, this is what time it is, therefore you should sync up your clock to this. And melatonin is one of those, and it's effective at that because, well, I should say evolutionarily, it is effective at that because it is tied to sunlight. And being tied to sunlight would be an excellent way to, well, if you use sunlight, that is going to be the most effective way at knowing what time of day it is, right? Or knowing what time of the seasons it is, because you can't fake sunlight, right? Well, I guess you can, right? You can fake it with the blue light that's coming out of your phones, and that has been implicated in some sort of in some insomnia, right? That if you're shining blue light at your eyes, that's actually convincing your body that it's still daylight outside, and that can cause some circadian rhythm problems. But I'm digressing. Let's move on. So melatonin secretion by the pineal gland has circadian rhythmicity regulated by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and I have no idea what this is, but it's a tiny region in the brain in the hypothalamus, and it's situated directly above the optic chiasm. Let's not worry too much about that. It's just know that it's secreted by the pineal gland, and it's found in the brain, and this SCN functions as the timing regulator of melatonin. Melatonin then follows the feedback loop to decrease the SCN neurofiring, and then the receptors, melatonin sub 1, the melatonin receptor sub 1 and the melatonin receptor sub 2 control this process. So this melatonin is a self-regulating process, and so basically it can shut its own production off after it's gotten to a certain concentration. So these melatonin receptors are found throughout the body in places such as the brain, retina, cardiovascular system, liver, gallbladder, colon, skin, kidneys, and many others. They could have just said all over the freaking body. Anyways, in 2019, oh, that's interesting. So only in 2019, the crystal structures for these melatonin receptors had been reported. So for those of you who are not aware, the crystal structures, sometimes we will take these proteins and we'll crystallize them, and when we crystallize them, they basically will go into a very ordered structure. And when they are in that very ordered structure, that allows us to hit it with X-rays, or yeah, I'll just say X-rays. There might be other ways to do it. I think there's also neutron diffraction as well, but let's say there are X-rays. These X-rays will hit the crystal, and then there will be a diffraction or a scattering pattern that comes off of that, and we use that diffraction pattern to mathematically figure out what the structure of each subunit is. And these subunits are going to be the molecules of, in this particular case, the melatonin receptors. And so we are actually able to figure out the structure of the melatonin receptor based on these diffraction patterns from the crystal structure. So that's pretty interesting to me that it took until 2019 for that to happen. So I think this should be sufficient, because if we don't keep on going, we will be here forever. So that is the first way that melatonin exerts its effects, is by binding to the melatonin receptors in the plasma membrane. Another way that melatonin can work its effects is by binding to intracellular proteins, such as Calmodulin. So what is Calmodulin? So this is a calcium-modulated protein, and it is a multifunctional intermediate of calcium-binding messenger proteins expressed in all eukaryotic cells. So it is an intracellular target for the secondary messenger calcium. So oftentimes, one way to signal to the cell to do something is to have a large influx of these calcium ions. And by influxing all these calcium ions, it will activate a lot of proteins that are within it that need to have this calcium to function properly, or at least switch on and or off. So Calmodulin, once it is bound to calcium, it acts as a part of the calcium signal transduction pathways by modifying its interactions with various target proteins, such as the kinases or phosphatases. And just so you know, kinases are molecules that will take the nucleoside triphosphates, and then they will steal one of the phosphates off of that and then add it to a protein. And then the phosphatases do pretty much the opposite. They will hydrolytically break apart phosphate groups. So that could be phosphates that are bound to other phosphates, or phosphates that are bound to sugars, or phosphates that are bound to proteins, anything. The group is large enough to, they basically just mean to break up a phosphate group. So just so you know, this is what they do, and melatonin is able to bind to Calmodulin. So let me see if there is melatonin. serotonin, nope. So the Wikipedia article doesn't have one of that. So melatonin will bind to calmodulin, that's another thing. It also can bind to orphan nuclear receptors. And what are these orphan nuclear receptors? So these are receptors. So in biochemistry, an orphan receptor is a protein that has a similar structure to identified receptors, but whose endogenous ligand has not yet been identified. So remember, these would be receptors where they do not know what their ligand is supposed to be. That's why they're called orphans. And then conversely, the orphan ligand refers to a ligand whose receptor has not yet been identified. So examples of orphan receptors are found in the G protein coupled receptors. So we just went over those, but also the nuclear receptors, nuclear receptor families. So let's see if there's anything. Just know if we figure out what the ligand is, we call them adopted, right? So that's sweet. But I don't think there's anything here that I want to talk about right now. So just know that these melatonins could theoretically also bind to these orphan nuclear receptors. Now, you might say, why are they orphan nuclear receptors if we know that melatonin binds to them? Well, in this particular case, melatonin is not the parent ligand, right? So melatonin is not the important ligand, it is a modulating ligand, and so that is why they're still called these orphan nuclear receptors. And continuing, these melatonin molecules can also exhibit an effect through being an antioxidant. So melatonin is able to have antioxidant properties in of itself. So the receptors associated with melatonin are as follows. The melatonin receptor type 1A, or MT1, which is what we talked about earlier. There's the melatonin receptor type 1B, or MT2, which is on the cell membrane. There's the melatonin receptor type 1C, which is found in fish, amphibians, and birds. Us, apparently not. And then there is 4, the quinone reductase 2 enzyme. And this is called the MT3 receptor, which is a detoxification enzyme. So we might go through that. Yeah, so we're going to discuss this later in the review. So there's that. And then the RZR, or the ROR alpha, and just so you know, this is the retinoid-related orphan nuclear hormone receptor, mouthful. So with this receptor, melatonin binds to the transcription factors in the nucleus. So just know that this retinoid-related orphan nuclear hormones, this is just one of the nuclear transcription factors, which means that they can bind to the DNA somehow and influence the activation or deactivation of genes. So, and then there's 6, the GPR50, the X-linked melatonin-related orphan receptor. It is effective in binding of melatonin to the MT1. So I've never heard of this GPR50 before. So this is a G protein coupled receptor 50, and it is a protein in which humans is encoded by this, and it's most closely related to the melatonin receptor, and it is able to heterodimerize with both MT1 and MT2 melatonin receptor subtypes. However, GPR50 has no effect on the MT2 function, so even though it can dimerize, it doesn't seem to affect its function. GPR50 prevented MT1 from both binding melatonin and coupling to G proteins. So this is actually forming or causing a self-modulatory effect is what it appears like. And GPR50 is the mammalian ortholog of melatonin receptor MEL1C described in non-mammalian vertebrates. So, okay, so this is the version that we see in fish, birds, and amphibians that we don't have. However, this seems to be closely related, or it seems to be the ortholog of that particular protein. And there's certain mutations that can be in this gene that have been linked with bipolar affective disorder, major depressive disorder, and schizophrenia. So that is interesting. And other GPR50 gene polymorphisms are associated with higher fasting circulating triglycerides. So these would be fats that are circulating around in your bloodstream, and lower levels of high-density lipoprotein, which is the HDL cholesterol, which is what many consider the good cholesterol. So just so you know, this GPR50 is the X-linked melatonin-related orphan receptor. Oh, and I think when they say X-linked, I think it means, yeah, so it's on the X chromosome, and so this is something that could theoretically have a gendered difference to them. Interesting, interesting. So, melatonin agonists, such as Romeltin, agomelatine, circadin, and TIK301, and TC-melton are introduced, and side effects will be discussed. And I don't know if I'm going to go over these, but perhaps I will. So in conclusion, melatonin and related drugs is a new and promising era for medicine. The melatonin receptors and melatonin drugs will take attention with greater interest day by day in the future. So this is the melatonin and the associated proteins, and I think I'm going to probably stop at around 1 hour so that, yeah, because this is getting a little long. So melatonin, this is a hormone secreted from the pineal gland at night. So it's secreted at night. Its peak levels in the dark are associated with age as well as various illnesses. Melatonin plays a role in the sleep-wake cycle, pubertal development, and seasonal adaptation. Melatonin is related with memory, and its associations with control of the body posture and balance have been shown. And that is interesting. Is that in... So yeah, that's in this review, the physiological effects of melatonin. So melatonin regulates memory formation by directly affecting hippocampal neurons. So what are hippocampal neurons or hippocampal neurons? These are the neurons of the hippocampus. And it comes from the Latin for seahorse, apparently. And it's a major component of the brain in humans and other vertebrates. And humans and other mammals have 2 hippocampi, one on each side of the brain. And so these are associated with the transformation from short-term memory into long-term memory, and in spatial memory that helps enable navigation. Right? So that is one of the things that the hippocampus does, and in Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus is one of the first regions in the brain to suffer damage. So just so you know, this is what the hippocampus is. And so here it is highlighted in blue. This is one of the hippocampi, or this is a hippocampus, and there are 2 hippocampi in the brain, one for each lobe, or one for each side. So these hippocampal neurons are regulated by melatonin. Anyways, melatonin has the anti-nociceptive, or the anti-pain, antidepressant, all of these things. I've gone over this before, and there are neuroprotective, anti-inflammatory, pain-modulating, blood pressure reducing, retinal vascular, seasonal reproductive, and ovarian Okay, sorry, there's just a lot of effects of melatonin. Sorry about that. I basically repeated part of the abstract there. So here is these are the peak melatonin levels at night, and they tend to decrease with age. So if you are in the 2nd decade, or if you're in your 20s, sorry, I don't know if 2 decade means between 10 and 20, or if it means 20 to 30. Just know that this isn't the best review over it. I just thought it was a decent review to get the job done. So here you can see that for younger, healthy individuals, your melatonin levels get pretty high at night, right? So they will have a pretty high peak at about 80 picograms per milliliter, which is actually a very, very, very small amount. Picograms are absolutely tiny. And as you age, this hump gets lower and lower as you get older, okay? So the dopaminergic system is important for behavioral and rewarding behavior and reward, and also in cases of drug addiction, such as cocaine. So what is the dopaminergic system? Well, these are nerves that are associated with dopamine. So here would be, these are the dopaminergic pathways, right? And so this would be one of the, or this would be the dopaminergic pathway. So these are sometimes called the dopaminergic projections, and they are the set of projection neurons in the brain that synthesize and release neurotransmitters, the neurotransmitter dopamine. Individual neurons in these pathways are referred to as dopamine neurons. And dopamine neurons have axons that run the entire length of the pathway. So these dopamine neurons will have a singular axon. If I'm reading this correctly, they will have a singular axon that will span this entire part of the brain. So the cell bodies of the neurons produce enzymes that synthesize dopamine, and the cell bodies, those are the thicker parts, or the somas of the nerve cell, and so this right here would be the soma. And they are transmitted through the projecting axons. So the axons are the long parts of the nerve cell. So these dopaminergic nerve cell bodies in such areas as the substantia nigra, which I've done another video on before, I believe. The substantia nigra pars compacta, they tend to be pigmented due to the presence of the black pigment melanin. So they're called this because they have melanin in them that makes them darker than the surrounding tissue. So the dopaminergic pathways are involved in many functions such as executive functions, learning, reward, motivation, neuroendocrine control, and dysfunction of these pathways and nuclei may be involved in multiple diseases and disorders such as Parkinson's, ADHD, addiction, and restless leg syndrome. Okay, so just so you know, this is what the dopaminergic pathway is. Interesting. So, going back here, this dopaminergic system is important for behavior and reward, also in cases of drug addiction, such as cocaine. Melatonin inhibits dopamine release. Interesting. So melatonin will inhibit dopamine release. So you will have less dopamine released. Now let me think about that. If you have more melatonin, you will not release as much dopamine. Okay, good to know. Anyways, the increase in melatonin receptor-related CAMP, cyclic adenosine monophosphate is the name of it, in the mesolimbic dopaminergic system shows that the effect of melatonin may be present in regulation of addictive behavior. It corrects the behavior disorders related to dopamine addiction and alleviates the findings of cocaine abstinence. So if you start to abstain from cocaine, if you start to detox from cocaine, and I would assume other alkaloids, melatonin might be one of the ways to suppress that dopamine addiction. So I believe you release a lot of dopamine as a result of taking opiates, or not opiates, but taking these alkaloid compounds. Other effects of melatonin are inhibition of dopamine release in the hypothalamus and the retina. So it's not just the hippocampus, the hypothalamus and the retina also release dopamine in some way. The anti-excitatory effects of melatonin, anti-excitatory meaning when a nerve cell becomes excited, it will then release or send a signal down. Melatonin suppresses that excitatory response. The anti-excitatory effects of melatonin are probably secondary to its antioxidant effects. So when it is administered in pharmacological doses in children, it leads to reduction in severity and frequency of epileptiform activity. So removing epilepsy from these children would be absolutely amazing. It shows an effect contrary to glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. For example, okay, it is an inhibitor. So high melatonin level is associated with exercise-related menstrual disorders. Oligospermia And what is that? Oligospermia is a male fertility issue caused by low sperm count. So it's low sperm count. So if you have high melatonin level, it is associated with the exercise-related menstrual disorders, the oligospermia, and also delayed puberty. So melatonin regulates the secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, also known as GRH, from the hypothalamic neurons. So the hypothalamus has neurons that will be releasing this gonadotropic-releasing hormone. And what is this specifically? So this is gonadotropic releasing hormone 1. So it is a small peptide. So this is a releasing hormone responsible for the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. So this is a protein, a peptide hormone that will cause the release of FSH and luteinizing hormone from this pituitary gland. And this gonadotropin-releasing hormone is a tropic peptide hormone synthesized and released from these GnRH neurons that are within this hypothalamus. And the peptide belongs to the gonadotropin-releasing hormone family. And so gonadotropin, these are things that are tropic for the gonads, or they will encourage the gonads to function properly or to live and grow. So this constitutes the initial step in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And so there's a lot of axes of the brain. So you have the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, but there are quite a few other axes that are involved. So this would be an example of this. So you have the hypothalamus will move its gonadotropin releasing hormone into the pituitary, or explicitly the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary will then release its hormones to the testes, which will result in the testes producing, say, testosterone, or the female ovaries producing estradiol or progesterone, right? So that is one of these axes, and they're called axes because there's an axis associated with them, and it's self-regulating, so it cycles back and forth. So let us see if, and then there are other axes such as the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, the hypothalamic neurohypophyseal system. Yeah, there's quite a few axes. So each one of them is a self-regulating cycle that ends up helping you. Well, it's like the circadian rhythm, right? Or the different types of biological clocks. They will increase and decrease their concentration throughout time, and you do this with through self-regulating mechanisms. So that is gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And so melatonin regulates the secretion of this gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamic neurons. So GnRH controls the production of luteinizing hormone and FSH, and melatonin stimulates the secretion of progesterone from the granulosa cells. So what are the granulosa cells? Well, these are the follicular cells that is closely related to the developing female gamete. So this would be something that stimulates the secretion of progesterone from these female-centric cells, right? Melatonin also suppresses the expression of the estrogen receptor and estrogen activation. So that's interesting that it can actually support some hormones while downregulating other hormones as well. So, neurological disorders which have been reported to be improved by administration of melatonin are as follows: Parkinsonism, Alzheimer's disease, brain edema, which is the swelling of the brain, or swelling of the brain, and also traumatic brain injury, alcoholism, depression, cerebral ischemia, which would be like a stroke. This would be the cutting off of circulation from parts of the brain. There's hyperhomocysteinuria. Homocysteine is a molecule that, how do I phrase that? I think the best way to do it is just to go to Wikipedia. So cysteine is one of the amino acids, and homocysteine is a different, it's a waste product from another amino acid. So here we go. So let me go to, so this is homocysteine right here. It's called homocysteine because cysteine normal cysteine would just have this carbon here and then have this thiol group right here, but homocysteine actually has this additional carbon over here. Actually, I think, yeah. So this is cysteine, has one carbon and then this thiol group. However, homocysteine has this extra carbon and then the thiol group. Okay, so homocysteine is a non-proteogenic amino acid, and let's see, I think it comes from the degradation of methionine. Okay, just know that it's recycled into methionine. Okay, so yeah, so it's biosynthesized from methionine through a multi-step process where methionine receives. Okay, so yeah, this is one of the waste products of methionine, and it can be turned into methionine through salvage, but that's not always the case. So if you have homocysteinuria, that means you have high levels of this homocysteine in your urine. So it's an inherited disorder of the metabolism of the amino acid methionine due to a deficiency of this synthase. So just know that that is what's happening, and melatonin has been implicated in helping that. There's also glioma and phenylketonuria, and that is another inability to process what I think is aspartic acid. So you have the inability to properly metabolize aspartic. Oh wait, no, not aspartic acid. Maybe I'm thinking of a different one. So, oh, sorry, phenylalanine. Yeah, phenylketonuria. Sorry, my bad. Backtrack. It's not aspartic acid. It is phenylalanine that you cannot process correctly, and therefore you end up having this phenylalanine in your urea. Or it's not really. I don't think it's phenylalanine. It's just one of the metabolites of phenylalanine. So let me see. I really wish. Okay, so I guess it is the buildup of phenylalanine in the diet. But somehow you're getting something into the. Here's the pathophysiology of phenylactinaria, which is due to the absence of the functional phenylalanine hydroxylase. Okay, well, I won't be able to get everything for you. I apologize. Just know that this is one of the genetic disorders. So Alzheimer's disease is an age-related progressive neurodegenerative disorder characterized with loss of cognitive function, dementia, and other neurobiological functions. And melatonin was shown to enhance anti-fibrillogenic effects. And these amyloidosis, so you have these amyloid plaques which are formed from these amyloid beta protein or peptides that come from the amyloid precursor protein. So you have the APP that gets proteolytically cleaved into these subunits. And there are multiple different pathways that APP can take, but if it goes down this pathway too much, it ends up forming too many of these amyloid beta subunits. And then these can actually form fibrils, or they can polymerize into these fibrils, which end up resulting in these amyloid plaques, which can cause Alzheimer's. So melatonin was shown to enhance the anti-fibrillogenic effects. So the disorder in which variations in production of endogenous melatonin production were shown as the disorders in which variations in production of endogenous melatonin production were shown are as follows. Okay, yeah. So there are sleep disorders, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, glaucoma, depression, breast cancer, prostate cancer, hepatoma, melanoma, congestive heart failure, cardiac syndrome X, and sepsis. So melatonin seems to be having a pretty wide range of effects, which makes sense for a hormone that is supposed to interact with a lot of these receptors throughout the entire body. It makes sense that there's going to be a lot of different diseases that are associated with the mismanagement of this particular hormone. So melatonin production is reduced with aging, various cancers, Alzheimer's disease, senile dementia, and pineal calcification, cardiovascular disorders and hypothalamic hamartoma. I don't know what that is. Let's see what this is. A rare benign brain tumor of the hypothalamus. So this would be a tumor of the hypothalamus, or craniopharyngioma, which lead to precocious or early puberty in youngsters. So is this the pituitary? I think it's a benign brain tumor that is by the pituitary gland, which can, if it's by the pituitary gland, it might be releasing pituitary-related hormones, which could then result in early puberty or growing too large. So there's a lot of bad things that can happen. So other disorders in which melatonin was shown to be reduced are stress, pain, endocrine, and metabolic disorders, and particularly the DM type 2 and acute and particularly diabetes mellitus type 2 and acute intermediate porphyria. So what is porphyria? Is a rare autosomal dominant metabolic disorder affecting the production of heme, resulting from a deficiency in this particular deaminase. Okay, so yeah, it's the inability to produce hemoglobin, or I shouldn't say hemoglobin, but the heme group correctly. So intravenous administration of melatonin increases peripheral blood circulation. Melatonin directly leads to vasoconstriction in cerebral arteries, so causes the constriction of these arteries. Daytime melatonin administration lowers the body temperature due to vasodilation in distal parts of the body. So what is this telling me? It tells me during the day, melatonin, if you administer it, will cause the blood vessels in the periphery to dilate or become bigger, and that will lower blood pressure. However, it causes vasoconstriction in the cerebral arteries. So the arteries in the brain, it causes them to squeeze tighter. Interesting. So there's different effects on different parts of the body in regards to the vascular system. The effects of melatonin on blood vessels seem to be related to its norandrenic effects and/or its effects on nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, and peripheral resistance-reducing effect may be related to the nitric oxide potentialization, which would be a way to basically making the cells more sensitive to nitric oxide. And then there's anti-noradrenic mechanism for inhibition of vasopressin release. So what is noradrenergic? What does noradrenergic mean? Sorry, I can't pronounce anything. So this is dealing with norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, and it's organic chemical in the catecholamine family, and it functions in the brain and body as a hormone and neurotransmitter. So it has an anti-noradrenergic mechanism which helps release or causes the inhibition of vasopressin release. And vasopressin, this is just one of the, just another peptide hormone. And it's a peptide hormone that is a part of the that is synthesized in the hypothalamus, and it is converted to, well, it starts as a peptide prohormone that is produced in the hypothalamus and then is converted into vasopressin, and then it travels down the axon where it goes into the pituitary gland. So that is just, it basically will inhibit that from releasing from the pituitary. So activation of the MT1 receptors leads to vasoconstriction, okay, and activation of the MT2 receptors leads to vasodilation. So this would tell me that the blood vessels, if they want to be blood vessels that constrict in response to melatonin, they would want to preferentially express the MT1 receptors. But if they want to dilate in response to melatonin, then they will preferentially express the MT2 receptors. Okay, so this would be a way that you could have the same hormone elicit opposite effects, right? So the same hormone could have opposite effects on different tissues depending on what receptor is being expressed in that tissue. So this is why it becomes very difficult to say what exactly a hormone does, because what a hormone does is context dependent. So the mechanism of effect of melatonin, you know what, I think I'm going to stop here because I think that I've spoken enough. So now we are going to get into the mechanistics and all this. I apologize we didn't go into mechanisms as much as I would have liked, but c'est la vie, right? So with that, thanks for listening, and hopefully I will see you tomorrow.